Hello, and welcome back to Psych 100. And we are going to be discussing today states of consciousness. So this is chapter 5 in your book. And states of consciousness are going to include discussions of sleep and use of drugs. All right. So the first question when we are discussing consciousness is, well, what is it? So to be conscious is to be aware. And so consciousness is a core feature of mental life that consists of sensations and perceptions of external events, as well as self-awareness of mental events, including our thoughts, our memories, and feelings about experiences and ourselves. Now, altered states of consciousness are states of awareness that differ from our normal alert waking consciousness. So, altered states are especially associated with dreaming, hypnosis, meditation, and use of psychoactive drugs. So, I'm sure many of you are familiar with basic ideas of drugs and how they work in terms of creating sometimes not only physical dependence, but also psychological dependence, which gives drugs their particular, reinforcing power. So, cultural conditioning greatly affects what altered states a person recognizes, seeks, considers normal, and attains. We in the United States are going to be recognizing and thinking about particular things in a particular way compared to somebody in a different country, and vice versa. So, we'll start off with a brief discussion of hypnosis. Your book goes into it a little bit. Hypnos, coming from the Greek meaning sleep. This is usually defined as an altered state characterized by narrowed attention and increased suggestibility. And this should not be a unfamiliar idea to you if you are familiar with any type of hypnosis or any kind of example of hypnosis. Hypnosis is not equal to sleep. So when someone is being hypnotized or someone is undergoing hypnosis, it is not the same as sleep when you start looking at it in the brain. So brain activity recorded during sleep and during a hypnotized state is completely different. And what we'll be doing in a little bit when we go through the stages of sleep is we'll look at how the brain is acting in different stages of sleep. So Ernest Hilgard said that hypnosis causes a dissociative state or a split in awareness. So this is what's known as the hidden observer, the detached part of the hypnotized person's awareness that silently watches over events. And so non-state theorists go with the idea that hypnosis is not a distinct state, but merely just a blend of conformities, particularly relaxation, obedience, imagination, and role-playing. So the reality of hypnosis is really the idea of basic suggestion effects. And this is the tendency of people that are hypnotized to carry out suggested actions as if they're involuntary. That's the whole idea behind hypnosis, right? Some guy comes up to the stage with a hypnotist, and the hypnotist puts him into a trance, and then the hypnotist wakes him or her up, and then asks them to do something. And usually it's funny and all good and fun. But despite the theatrical portrayal, hypnotized individuals are generally in control of their behavior. They're not completely at the beck and call of the hypnotist. And so what we see is that most people that are hypnotized won't act out suggestions deemed immoral or repulsive. And so hypnotic susceptibility can actually be measured using the Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Scale to determine how easily a person can become hypnotized. So can hypnosis help with any of the following things? Well, yes and no. So hypnosis can be used to relieve pain. It can't be used to cure addictions. It can be used to decrease anxiety, and mixed results come in terms of improving memory. So some evidence shows that it can enhance memory. However, it may increase the number of false memories as well. So hypnotic suggestions concerning sensations are among the most effective. All right. So meditation I'm sure some of you are familiar with meditation in terms of its mental benefits, and I'm not sure if any of you do meditation, but it's a pretty good exercise, a mental exercise. But it's used to alter consciousness, focusing attention and interrupting the typical flow of thoughts, worries, and analysis, which is exactly the allure of it in today's modern world. Now, there are two major forms of meditation. You have concentrative meditation, which is attending to a single focal point, such as a single thought, and mindfulness meditation, which is open or expansive. So this is more difficult to attain. Now, meditation can help in reducing stress and anxiety due to the fact that it elicits a relaxation response. So there is physical benefits, such as lowered heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tension, other signs of stress, and improved immune system activity for those that engage in meditation. And brain scans of people in a meditative state actually show changes in their brain activity. So now we're going to get into sleep. So I talk about sleep in my physiological psychology classes, and we go into a lot of detail in those classes. I try to keep it mainly the most important information coming into this chapter, since again, Psych 100 is a gen ed class, but I will give you some good information about sleep. Sleep is an innate biological rhythm, essential for survival. So it is an internal rhythm that is actually generated by the brain and by cells in the brain. Sleep patterns show flexibility, and 7 to 8 hours remains the average, but of course we know that as college students, grad students, we don't really get 7 to 8 all the time, but that's the national average. The amount of daily sleep tends to decline as we go from birth to old age. Now, moderate sleep loss affects mainly vigilance and performance on routine or boring tasks. The idea of vigilance is how well you are able to keep your attention at a mundane or at a typical task, right? So people that undergo sleep deprivation may experience hypersomnia, which is excessive daytime sleepiness, micronaps, or even temporary sleep deprivation psychosis, where individuals have been seen to lose contact with reality. Sorry, I have to go forward to be able to click this YouTube link. So what happens if you stop sleeping?
Sleep. You can never have enough of it, it seems. In fact, sometimes it literally feels like you aren't getting enough. But what if you stopped sleeping altogether? Strangely, science understands relatively little about why we sleep or how it evolved in the first place. After all, laying unconscious and dormant for hours on end while predators lurk hardly seems advantageous or smart. But we have discovered a few correlations. For example, adults who sleep between 6 to 8 hours a night tend to live longer. Excessive sleep, however, can lead to medical problems including cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Similarly, chronic sleep deprivation has been linked to aspects of cardiovascular disease, obesity, depression, and even brain damage. But what if you stopped sleeping right now? Well, after your first sleepless night, your mesolimbic system becomes stimulated and dopamine runs rampant. And this may actually trigger some extra energy, motivation, positivity, and even sex drive. Sounds appealing, but it's a slippery slope. Your brain slowly begins to shut off the regions responsible for planning and evaluating decisions, leading to more impulsive behavior. Once exhaustion sets in, you'll find yourself with slower reaction times and reduced perceptual and cognitive functions. After a day or two of no sleep, the body loses its ability to properly metabolize glucose and the immune system stops working as well. In some cases, 3 days of no sleep has led to hallucinations. Care about how you look? Studies have shown a direct correlation between sleep deprivation and a person's perceived beauty. That is to say, sleep-deprived individuals appeared less healthy and less attractive than when they were well rested. The longest scientifically documented case of being awake was 264 hours, or 11 days. And while they did develop problems with concentration, perception, and irritability, the surprising truth is that they suffered no serious long-term health effects. In fact, no individuals under these documented conditions experienced medical, physiological, neurological, or psychiatric problems. But there are limited studies, and this doesn't mean permanent damage couldn't be inflicted with more time. Sleep deprivation experiments on rats, for example, generally lead to death after about 2 weeks, but scientists aren't totally sure if they're dying from the lack of sleep or from the stress of constantly being woken up. Perhaps we should look at fatal familial insomnia for an answer, a rare genetic disease of the brain which causes progressively worsening insomnia or sleeplessness, leading to hallucinations, dementia, and ultimately death. This disease has only affected around 100 people in the world, but their average survival span was around 18 months. Over time, the lack of sleep becomes worse and the body's organs begin to shut down. So, while lack of sleep won't necessarily kill you quickly, continual sleep deprivation will have a negative effect on your body. Sleep tight, but not too much.
So there is an ideal amount of sleep. Again, you shouldn't be staying in your bed for 14 hours, but you should also definitely try to aim to get those necessary, 6 to 8 hours. And research, particularly in Alzheimer's disease, shows that periods of deep sleep help to be able to clear out cellular debris from the brain. So when it's light outside, you actually have information from light going in through the through the visual system to the suprachiasmatic nucleus that lies in and around the hypothalamus, which actually leads to lower levels of melatonin, causing you to stay awake. And at nighttime, when there's no light, it actually leads to the suprachiasmatic nucleus increasing the amount of melatonin through synthesis through serotonin, its precursor, leading to you feeling sleepy. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus lies right here. And cells in the suprachiasmatic nucleus actually have their own internal rhythms of approximately 24 hours. And it's been shown that actually if you were to take some of those cells out and actually transplant them into hamsters that have been genetically modified to run on a 20-hour rhythm, that they will adjust according to the cell's internal rhythm that you transplant into them. So what are the functions of sleep and what are the stages of sleep that we go through? Well, there are repair and restorative theories of sleep where lowering body and brain activity and metabolism can actually help to conserve energy and lengthen life, as well as clear out cellular debris that's been accumulating throughout the evening or throughout the day. Each sleep cycle lasts approximately 90 minutes and consists of stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2 REM, not necessarily strictly in that order the entire night. The first half of your sleep cycle, you're predominantly in non-REM sleep. And then your second half of your sleep cycle, you are predominantly, or the second half of the evening rather, you're more so in REM sleep. So how do we measure these stages? Well, we measure it through the use of EEG, which is electroencephalographs or electroencephalography, where we record tiny electrical signals and brain waves that are generated by the brain. So while awake, we have small fast waves that are known as beta waves, and immediately before sleep, as we're in a relaxed state, this shifts to larger and slower alpha waves. And you can see these in EEG readouts. So stage 1 is considered light sleep, where the EEG consists of small irregular theta waves. And during stage 1, our breathing and our heart rate slows down, preparing us for sleep. This is also the period of time where we experience and where we may experience hypnic jerks, where you have that false sense of falling, and you suddenly just shake and jerk around, and then you realize, oh my god, why'd that happen? And then you go back to sleep. Stage 2 is consists of sleep spindles and K complexes. So there are two components of stage 2 sleep: sleep spindles and K complexes. Sleep spindles are short bursts of distinctive brainwave activity generated by the thalamus, whereas K complexes are also noted in our readouts. Now, you won't need to ever in this class identify these different types of waves based on EEG readouts. But if you were a sleep researcher or you were someone that studied EEG readouts, you would need to know these for sure. Stage 3 and 4 are oftentimes lumped together and they're referred to as slow wave sleep or SWS. This is where the appearance of delta waves comes about. So these waves are very large and very slow, and this is the period where they come about in slow wave sleep. Now, REM sleep is known as rapid eye movement sleep, and this is generally the period that is associated with dreaming. So when we're awake and relaxed, so this is getting ready to go to bed, we have a lot of alpha waves. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 and 4 with the presence of delta waves. So note how these waves are larger and more spread out compared to the burst of activity that's going on here. Now, REM sleep is also known as paradoxical sleep, and the reason for that is because during the period of REM sleep, your body is in a state of paralysis where you're not acting out your dreams, you're not moving, but your brain activity is resembling in some ways, how you are when you're awake, which is why it's known as paradoxical sleep. So in REM sleep, you actually have a lot of brain activity compared to non-REM sleep. And this is similar to when you're awake. So as you go throughout the night, you spend a lot more time at the first half of your sleep cycle, spending it in non-REM sleep, and generally little in REM sleep. But as you get into the second half of your night, you'll actually spend a little bit more time in REM throughout the evening until you wake up. So as you go throughout life, as we've already mentioned, generally as we age, the amount of daily sleep will tend to decline. So here's the total amount of daily sleep consisting of REM and non-REM sleep. So here, note that when you are a baby, you're pretty much spending a lot of time sleeping, right? But generally, as you go from maybe about 14 to 18 years to 35, 45, this remains a little consistent. You're getting roughly, 7 hours of sleep. And then as you get to 70 and 80, you're getting less and less, and you're spending a little bit more time awake. So REM, rapid eye movement. So without looking like a creeper, I would suggest you check it out sometime in someone that's sleeping. So obviously, if you're watching someone sleep and you're seeing their eyes fluttering underneath their eyelid, they're most likely in rapid eye movement sleep. This is associated with dreaming, which we'll discuss soon. REM is associated with a return of fast, irregular EEG patterns that are similar to stage 1 and similar to when we're awake. So a small proportion early on is compared to slow wave sleep, and as the evening progresses, like we've already mentioned, we spend more time in REM sleep than slow wave sleep. And this is known as paradoxical sleep because we have increased cerebral activity and loss of core muscle tone and muscle activity. So what are the functions of sleep in general, non-REM and REM? So the functions of non-REM may help us recover from bodily fatigue throughout the day, right? To calm the brain in order to begin memory consolidation, to be able to repair and restore our bodies, and prepare us for the next day. REM sleep may help in completing memory consolidation. So if you're actually awakened during REM sleep, most often people are able to report their dreams. And that's often why we say, okay, well, this must be associated with dreaming. Not only that, but we also see increases in brain activity. Brain areas associated with imagery and emotion are more active during the periods of REM sleep. Irregular heartbeats, blood pressure, and breathing waver, as well as sexual arousal occur within the period of REM sleep. And lack of muscle paralysis during REM actually can result in what's known as REM behavior disorder, where this is a pretty dangerous disorder in which you would act out your dreams. Muscle paralysis is pretty important for REM because if you think about you running in a race or running down a hallway, you would want your body to pretty much not allow you to get up during that, right? You wouldn't want to act out every single dream and, punch someone that you're sleeping next to or anything like that. So, sleep disorders and disturbances. So, insomnia is difficulty in getting to sleep or staying asleep. So, this can be temporary or chronic. So, temporary insomnia can just be the result of worrying, stress, or excitement, such as when you're a kid or even now, getting excited about Christmas or your birthday and not being able to sleep well the night before because you are, excited. So with insomnia, the big idea is don't fight it. So, go do something and then go back to bed when you feel you're struggling to stay awake. Now, it's when it becomes chronic that it becomes more of an issue, right? So if sleeping problems last for more than 3 weeks, that's known as chronic insomnia, and that's when you should definitely get something checked. Now, drug dependency insomnia is sleep loss that is caused by withdrawal from sleeping pills. So sleeping pills, taking melatonin, these are not good things that you should just go immediately and rely on, right? And we'll have more discuss about that when we start talking about some depressants at the end of the lecture. So behavioral remedies, sleeping pills are pretty poor in terms of treating insomnia. One big idea with insomnia and getting better sleep is to change lifestyle and behavioral techniques. So, such as stimulus control, where we link a response with specific stimuli, where you only sleep and relax and go to bed at specific times. You don't eat dinner in your bed, you don't do anything else in your bed except for sleep. You're making sure that your bed is associated with you going to sleep, and that's it. Sleep restriction, maintaining normal bedtime hours. Paradoxical intention, so keeping your eyes open in the dark and trying to stay awake as long as possible, where sleep can then come unexpectedly. Relaxation, and then avoiding things like exercise, food intake, and stimulants very close to bedtime. So don't drink a huge cup of coffee before you go to bed. Don't eat a big meal. Don't exercise right beforehand. These are things that you can change in your lifestyle in terms of your behavior, which can ultimately affect how you are able to go to sleep. So sleepwalking, known as some somnambulists, just gently guide sleepwalkers back to bed. It's just a myth in terms of don't ever wake up a person that's sleepwalking. The media portrays it as something like that's horrendous that is going to happen. That's not actually the case. So this does occur during stage 3 or 4, and it does not occur during REM. And one question that I could put on the exam is, well, why doesn't sleepwalking occur during REM? And the reason why it doesn't occur during REM is because during REM, you have muscle paralysis, where you cannot actually get up and act out your dreams, right? So sleepwalking, which is a thing of you using your muscles, cannot occur during a period where you're under sleep paralysis. Sleep talking occurs mostly during non-REM, and that explains why it's mainly nonsense when we're sleep talking. And then a condition known as sexsomnia, which is sleep sex, having sex while you're asleep, which can definitely be very damaging to marriages and to relationships, particularly if the other partner is unaware of what is happening. So, a little difference and distinction between nightmares and night terrors. A nightmare is a bad dream that's associated with REM sleep, so that is a dream that has negative content, right? A night terror, on the other hand, occurs often during stage 4 sleep, where the person suffers total panic and can hallucinate dream images around them. Now, again, this is different than a nightmare. So, night terrors can last between 15 to 20 minutes. The person may vaguely remember the incident and most often is sweating and in a state of panic. It's more common in childhood but can still be seen in adults. So whereas a nightmare is something that you can generally remember in terms of it's a dream with negative content, night terrors are often not really remembered, and the child or the adult wakes up in a complete panic, often sweating, screaming, etc., with often little memory of what caused that. Sleep apnea may be diagnosed in individuals who snore loudly with short silences and loud gasps or snorts. Basically, the idea of sleep apnea is that the brain is not getting enough oxygen. So during sleep apnea, and it depends, there's different types, such as central sleep apnea and obstructive sleep apnea, but the cycle of needing oxygen, gulping in air, and then falling back to sleep may occur greater than 100 times a night. This is really when your body is essentially freaking out because it senses that it doesn't have enough oxygen. You're gasping for air throughout the night, and then you're going back to sleep. So this could lead to brain damage due to the lack of oxygen and lead to a hard time functioning during the day because your brain really isn't getting enough oxygen to maintain appropriate activity. So central sleep apnea is when the brain doesn't really send signals to the diaphragm. And obstructive sleep apnea may be when upper air passages are blocked. And individuals who are overweight or obese may often suffer from sleep apnea, although it's not 100% all the time. So continuous positive airway pressures, or CPAP masks, can be used to aid the sleeper during sleep, be able to provide enough oxygen. And oftentimes, these don't look very appealing, but for somebody with sleep apnea, these could, be a lifesaver in terms of sensing if oxygen intake is low and being able to administer oxygen to the sleeper. So SIDS is known as sudden infant death syndrome, and this is also known as crib death. This is the leading cause of death in children between 1 month and 1 year of age. Now, babies at risk for SIDS are often premature, and one really good saying is to put the baby back to sleep. So the best sleeping position, which is a major risk, sleeping position is a major risk for this, is to lay the baby on their back rather than on their stomach or their side. Now, this is always changing from year to year, and when I talked about this in this past semester in the spring, some students had told me that there were different suggestions, and it wasn't necessarily only put the baby back to sleep, but the idea behind this in terms of sleep position affecting health is that you don't want to bundle up a newborn or cover them with pillows and blankets because depending on the age, babies are unable to lift up their heads or be able to adjust themselves in terms of those musculature movements. So oftentimes the babies will be unable to correct themselves and may suffocate and die. So you should avoid bundling newborns or covering them with pillows or blankets or keeping a lot of stuffed animals in the cribs with them. Another thing to avoid is often sleeping with a brand new baby, just because incidents can occur where an adult has rolled over on an infant before or anything like that. Narcolepsy is a sudden irresistible sleep attack, one of the most dramatic sleep problems. So emotional excitement is one thing that commonly triggers narcolepsy. So oftentimes narcolepsy is pretty exaggerated, where somebody just all of a sudden drops down and goes to sleep. One physiological basis for this is the cataplexy, which is a sudden temporary paralysis of muscles that leads to complete body collapse. And then another thing is that REM sleep may possibly intrude into the waking state, causing an individual, again, because REM sleep is where the period of muscle paralysis occurs, for that individual to drop down. It's not as dramatic as the media makes it out to be, but it can definitely have disastrous side effects if you're driving in a car, if you're walking in a busy intersection, etc. So this is a funny comic that I liked. So does everyone dream? And the answer is yes, everyone does dream. And REM rebound is actually something that happens when individuals are awoken when entering REM sleep. Multiple times, the need for REM increases after so many days of no REM sleep. So this is pretty awful in like laboratory experiments because researchers can actually see individuals transition into REM sleep based on their brain activity, and they can wake the person up right before they go into REM sleep or right as soon as they enter REM sleep. And what we see in the lab is that if you wake a person up enough times and their body does not get the amount of REM sleep that it needs, rebound will occur when that individual is able to go to sleep again. So here are a few dream theories, and we'll start off with the most fun one, which is psychodynamic dream theory, championed by Freud, our good friend Sigmund Freud. So this emphasis is on internal conflicts and unconscious forces. So dreams that we have are based on wish fulfillment, so the expression of our unconscious desires. So in our dreams, we have disguised dream symbols, so images that have deeper symbolic meaning. So to understand a dream, we need to analyze its manifest content, which is the obvious visible meaning, to uncover the latent content. So Freudians, psychodynamic theorists, psychoanalytic theorists aren't really taking things at face value, but they're actually looking at the hidden symbolic meaning behind particular things, right? And that's why Sigmund Freud is one of those people. Again, a lot of the theories cannot be falsified in terms of you can't say it's false, but it's also probably not true. So difference between manifest and latent content. The manifest content, if you're dreaming about a carrot, you dreamt about a carrot, that's what it is. But the latent content would be a penis, right? Freud was very big on thinking about sexual motivation and how the id, as part of our developing personality, is constantly seeking out pleasurable things. So another dream theory is the activation synthesis hypothesis, which in general says that dreaming is a physiological process where the brain is pretty much just trying to make sense of what's going on in terms of activity. So lower brain centers are on and activated, while the frontal areas of the cortex controlling higher mental abilities are mostly shut down during REM, and that has to deal with the neurotransmitters that are at play there. So this is why dreams are usually meaningless, not all the time, but since dreams are created from memories and past experiences, parts of dreams can reflect an individual's own mental life, emotions, and concerns, of course. But the activation synthesis hypothesis, you can sort of remember this based on the activity of the brain and the synthesis or the putting together of that activity. So the cortex constructs a story to make sense of the internal signals that are arising from lower brain centers. And the last theory we'll talk about is the neurocognitive dream theory, where our dreams reflect everyday waking thoughts and dreams. So similar regions of the brain are active while awake and asleep, and dreams are a conscious expression of REM sleep processes that are sorting and storing our daily experiences, where we have daily experiences, all of us do, and dreams are basically a way for us to be able to sort and store those within our cortex in terms of our memory to be able to aid us at a later date. Okay, so we talked about changes of consciousness as relates to sleep. Now we'll talk about changes in consciousness as it relates to types of drugs. So psychoactive drugs are substances that are able to alter attention, emotion, judgment, memory, time sense, self-control, or perception. Psychoactive drugs have an effect on the brain and nervous system. Now, I know that you hopefully haven't already blocked this out, but this is a presynaptic terminal and this is a postsynaptic terminal. Drugs have their effect here at the level of the synapse. Drugs play a role by either enhancing a particular dopaminergic transmission. They can block receptors. They can mimic neurotransmitters that are naturally occurring within the body. So all drugs have their effects here at the level of the synapse. So basic drug receptor interactions. Now this is going to be important to understand, and I'll take my time on this slide. Receptors are proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Receptors recognize specific molecular shapes, and typically these are endogenous neurotransmitters, so particularly dopamine in the case of drugs. So an agonist is a drug that binds to a receptor and mimics the action of the endogenous transmitter. So a dopamine agonist would bind to a dopamine receptor and mimic the action of dopamine. An antagonist, so let me change the pen color. An antagonist is a drug that binds to a receptor and prevents or blocks the action. So a dopamine antagonist would bind to the receptor and prevent dopamine from binding, thus preventing action. Okay, so that's agonists and antagonists. Now, you can remember antagonists because if you are a frequent reader, an antagonist in the story is sort of like the villain or somebody that is doing something to prevent the story from either continuing on or to prevent the hero from saving the day or whatever. Now, there is a difference between affinity, how well a drug or transmitter fits into a receptor, and its efficacy. And efficacy is whether a drug or transmitter actually has an effect on the brain. So it is not possible to have low affinity and high efficacy. And what I want you to do is just either pause the video or I'll give you like a brief 10-second sort of intermission. But I want you to think about why this is not possible. Why is it not possible for a drug to have low affinity and high efficacy? This is not possible because low affinity means that it does not bind well. If a drug does not bind well to a receptor, then it really can't have an effect. And high efficacy means that you're having a high effect. So a drug cannot bind poorly and cause a great reaction. It is possible, on the other hand, to have high affinity and low efficacy. So high affinity and low efficacy is an example of an antagonist, a drug that is able to bind and prevent an action. So an agonist, something that's able to bind appropriately, creating a drug effect. An antagonist may bind and then prevent the complete receptor interaction from its normal neurotransmitter. The natural reward pathway that exists within your brain, this is rewarding the body for basic actions and behaviors that are sustaining survival. So you have areas within the midbrain that are projecting upwards throughout the cortex, particularly dopamine. So you have the ventral tegmental area, which will send projections to the nucleus accumbens. This will then send dopamine projections to the prefrontal cortex as well as to the cortical regions of the brain. So dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter in the body's natural reward pathway. Now, what happens with drugs is drugs hijack this natural reward pathway. They cause a supraphysiological, supra meaning above normal, they cause a supraphysiological release of dopamine. Now, when your body does something good, like has sex, eats, accomplishes a task, dopamine is released. It makes you feel good. Now, when you take drugs, which you should never do, dopamine hits a huge spike. You have a huge spike in dopamine, which causes your body to feel really, really good. So the next time, if you're on a drug, would I want to do cocaine or would I want to do this drug or eat a burger? Most often, people who are addicted will choose to do the drug because the drug creates a greater response of dopamine compared to eating a burger, right? So in general, psychoactive drugs fall into two categories. Instrumental use, which is using a drug to address a particular issue, such as painkillers for headaches or cups of coffee for alertness. And yes, coffee contains caffeine, and caffeine is a drug. And recreational use. Recreational use compared to instrumental use is where you are focusing on experiencing a particular effect. So you take the drug to experience a psychoactive effect, such as getting high on heroin or taking OxyContin or oxycodone for pain relief. Pain relief when you may not be experiencing or needing to actually take oxycodone. Now, drug misuse and abuse is not, I'm trying to say, it's very well known, particularly in the media, that drug abuse and misuse does happen, which leads to unfortunate deaths, such as Corey Monteith, Amy Winehouse, and Philip Seymour Hoffman. Psychoactive drugs are highly prone to be abused. And drug abuse is related to personal maladjustment, so it has to deal with the person as well. The reinforcing quality of the drugs make us feel good, that's why people do them, right? If a drug causes somebody to violently throw up every single time they took it, most often they're not going to do the drug. Peer group influences and environmental influences, and expectations about drug effects. So polydrug abuse is the risk of drug interactions that can enhance the effects of either drug alone, and most oftentimes is the case with celebrity overdoses. They often have alcohol and one other type of drug, or I'm not going to say it's rarely ever, but oftentimes you see in Hollywood media where drug misuse and abuse is often the combination of a lot of different drugs that come into play that will lead to the deaths of individuals. Now, drug dependence falls broadly into two categories. Physical dependence, which we can think of as addiction, is when we use a drug to maintain bodily comfort. So basically, we take it to avoid feeling withdrawal symptoms, and we take more and more to overcome the development of tolerance. The second type of dependence is psychological dependence. This has to deal with maintaining your comfort or well-being in terms of rewarding qualities. So the rewarding quality of drugs, surges of dopamine. So marijuana, for instance, people aren't physically addicted to marijuana. People don't take marijuana to avoid withdrawal symptoms and to overcome tolerance. People do take marijuana, on the other hand, to maintain that psychological state that they experience while doing the drug. Whereas other drugs, such as heroin or cocaine, can result in psychological dependence as well as addiction, where in order to avoid withdrawal symptoms, the individual takes the drug. Okay, so now we're going to go through some various classes of drugs. So the first that we'll talk about are uppers, particularly amphetamines, also known as speed, bennies, dexies, amp, uppers. So these are synthetic stimulants. And today, the main legitimate use, note the word legitimate, use is to treat childhood hyperactivity and overdoses of depressant drugs. So what have become known as study drugs are both mixes of amphetamine, Adderall. So Adderall and Ritalin are known as study drugs that are mixes of different types of amphetamines. So methamphetamine is the more potent variation of amphetamine. And these amphetamines rapidly produce drug tolerance. So amphetamines speed up the body's resources, and brain damage can occur with repeated use, and this can lead to amphetamine psychosis.
Two or 3 years ago, we did a study of patients who come into the emergency department here at Royal Perth with an amphetamine-related presentation. And we developed this theory that some of these people might have a silent abnormality in the brain that neither they nor the doctors looking after them are aware of. We did this study, an MRI brain study, to look for any abnormalities that may or may not be present. Before we started out, we said to ourselves, if we found 10% had an abnormality, we would have thought that was pretty impressive. 23 of the 30 are what we'd call serious users, and then there were 7 people who were recreational users. And of those 23 people, 5 had an abnormality in the brain that nobody suspected. And our result was basically 20%. So it was actually much higher than what we thought. The most common abnormality we found is a little spots on the brain called unidentified bright objects. So you can see here there's this little bright area in the frontal lobe of the brain. While we know that drugs like amphetamines cause constriction or narrowing of blood vessels, so the blood vessels that big, it narrows down, the blood with oxygen isn't really getting through. And so the brain cells that are around these small blood vessels die off and form scar tissue. That's probably what those UBOs are, is an area of scarring of brain tissue. We do know that as you get older, you're more likely to have these UBOs. Once you're in your 80s, over 90% of people have UBOs. Once you're in your 60s, about 20% of people have UBOs. But at the age of 30, less than 1%, 0.5% of people should have a UBO. The average age of the people in our study was 27 years. So these are young people. People who have these UBOs as they get older are much more likely to suffer problems with the cognitive function of the brain, stroke, dementia and death. People would have seen those public health pictures of somebody before and after using methamphetamine, and it clearly shows that they're aging on the outside. But we're forming the view that not only is it aging you on the outside, it's aging you on the inside. You might have a elderly grandparent who's fine and they're living and eating and breathing and talking and doing things, but when you talk to them, they're a bit vague, they're a bit forgetful, they're not as sharp as they used to be. It'd be the same kind of thing, but obviously at a much younger age.
So the second upper we'll discuss is cocaine, also known as coke, snow, bluff, snuff, flake. It's a CNS stimulant. so extracts from leaves of the coca plant. These are similar to amphetamines. However, amphetamine effects typically last a bit longer. Cocaine's quickly metabolized. Now, the capacity for abuse of cocaine rivals that of heroin. And many animals in actual studies that are given cocaine will actually self administer it to the point of death. Cocaine increases dopamine and norepinephrine, and essentially what this does is it arouses the brain and it floods the brain with pleasure, which makes it physically dependent because you are constantly wanting to obtain that high that you were able to get with that drug that you can't get without it. So if stopped, a period of anhedonia is experienced, and anhedonia is the inability to feel pleasure. And of course, because if you're so high and you feel so good taking cocaine and then you no longer have that, you are going to definitely feel, this sense of anhedonia.
In the words of music legend Whitney Houston,
Your crack is whack.
but with all the extra attention lately thanks to Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, what exactly is crack cocaine? Is it really as whack as it's portrayed to be? Crack is simply another form of cocaine which comes from the leaves of a coca plant. After mixing powdered cocaine with a weak base such as baking soda, it changes composition and a solid is produced, often referred to as rocks. This solid has a much lower melting point than cocaine, allowing it to be smoked as opposed to snorted. In fact, it's called crack because of the sound it makes when heated. But why smoke it? Well, the lungs are an extremely quick and effective way of getting something into the bloodstream. Those with asthma, for example, use inhalers to quickly put a drug directly into their system. When smoke meets the large surface area in your lungs, it too slips right through the membrane and heads straight to your brain in as little as 8 seconds. This is much faster and more intense than the effects of snorted cocaine, which generally takes around 10 minutes to reach the brain. However, once in the brain, crack and cocaine are effectively identical. Initially, users feel energized, alert, and much more aware of their senses. In the brain, crack acts on the ventral tegmental area, releasing large amounts of dopamine, the chemical often associated with feelings of pleasure and euphoria. This dopamine travels between brain cells, called neurons, and binds to receptors that trigger the good feelings. Now, normally, this dopamine would be reabsorbed back into the neuron by a dopamine transporter. However, crack alters this process. It attaches to the transporter and blocks the reabsorption, allowing dopamine to build up and continually stimulate the receptors. As a result, you feel, really good for about 10 minutes. But soon after, the dopamine levels in the brain plummet, causing an extreme low and often feelings of depression, which is why many users typically smoke more, hoping to reach that high again. Unfortunately, these dopamine levels can take a long time to naturally replenish, contributing to physical and psychological dependence or addiction, as well as increased irritability, restlessness, and paranoia. In some cases, crack or cocaine abuse can lead to something called delusional parasitosis, the feeling that bugs or insects are crawling under the skin. This often leads to self-destructive behavior like scratching or biting in an effort to get rid of the imagined bugs. In the most serious cases, crack's impact on the heart can cause heart attacks, strokes, or even stop the heart altogether, leading to death. Simply put, on the extreme end of things, crack can get pretty whack. Thanks to
So our next drug in the upper category is MDMA, or ecstasy. This is chemically similar to amphetamine and is a stimulant, and it can produce hallucinations. Now, MDMA increases serotonin, which is often seen with our mood-elevating effects. So serotonin does have an impact on our mood, and so our mood-elevating effects under influence of MDMA is due to increases in serotonin. Now, MDMA also, interestingly, diminishes sexual performance. Hyperthermia or heart arrhythmias can occur under the influence of MDMA, and long-term effects include feelings of anxiety or depression and signs of underlying brain damage.
With an estimated 2 million pills being smuggled into the US every day, and 1/3 of students at universities like Stanford saying they've tried it, MDMA, or Molly, has become a popular drug of choice. But What exactly is it, and how does it affect your body? Scientifically known as 3,4-methylene dioxy and methylamphetamine, MDMA is usually taken in pill form and supposed to be composed of the pure chemical. Ecstasy, on the other hand, is the term for MDMA, which has been chemically altered with other additives like amphetamine or caffeine. In its pure form, MDMA affects the neurotransmitters in your brain. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in your body which relay messages while also controlling things such as reflexes, emotion, and memory. In particular, the neurotransmitter called serotonin controls appetite, sleep, memory, learning, and, in this case, mood. When something really great happens in your life, say you fall in love, there's an increase in the release of serotonin from nerve cells, which ultimately stimulates your body and makes you feel happy. And it just so happens that when you take effective amounts of MDMA, these same cells are triggered to release enormous amounts of serotonin, along with other neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, which trigger even more electrochemical firing in the brain. This change creates the intense experience of happiness, feeling social, increased empathy, and the inability to sleep, which is likely why it's such a popular party drug. These feelings generally last around 3 to 8 hours as your brain cells naturally work to reuptake the serotonin and have it chemically destroyed. But because MDMA releases so much serotonin, your body also destroys more than usual. This means when your brain function is back in its normal state, there is less serotonin available to bind to your receptors and make you feel good with normal events. This can also lead to a fairly severe hangover with side effects such as negative mood, spouts of depression, irritability, and feeling extra tired. Despite the negative effects, MDMA is being studied as a potential therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety. PTSD patients generally have a decrease in brain communication between the amygdala and the hippocampus, but MRI analysis has shown that MDMA actually increases the communication in these regions. However, this treatment remains fairly controversial as studies on rats and monkeys have shown that even small amounts of MDMA can not only destroy the endings of brain cells involved in the release of serotonin, but potentially cause permanent brain damage. If you
Following in our upper category, we have caffeine. Caffeine is the most frequently used psychoactive drug in North America, and it would be really funny if you were drinking coffee right now during this lecture or tea. But oftentimes, caffeine is really coming in the form of those drinks. Look at anybody at Mason, why Starbucks is so popular. It's due to the intake of caffeine. Caffeine suppresses drowsiness due to its effect at the adenosine receptor. It's an adenosine receptor antagonist, which means that it blocks adenosine from being able to bind. Overuse of caffeine may result in caffeineism, which is an unhealthy dependence. Some individuals can be very dependent on caffeine. Oftentimes you'll see people looking like zombies in the morning if they are unable to have their cup of coffee. Now, caffeine is a drug, and ideally it should be used in moderation. Now, no-dose was a drug that I definitely took in high school. It's as safe as coffee. A fast-acting alertness aid, which is roughly 200 milligrams of caffeine. And you can become very dependent on caffeine very quickly. It's not as spoken about as like something like heroin or meth, but it is a drug.
Millions of Americans use caffeinated beverages every day as a pick-me-up. It is, after all, the world's most popular drug, and with new caffeine-infused products like energy drinks, gum, and even beef jerky hitting the shelves, our love affair with caffeine shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. Caffeine is an interesting drug because when it enters the body, it breaks up into 3 different yet very similar molecules. When metabolized in the liver, enzymes chisel off one of 3 methyl groups to form these 3 metabolites with 3 different effects on your body: theobromine, paraxanthine, and theophylline. While in the brain, this caffeine party crashes adenosine receptors, blocking the normal gas, adenosine, from doing its job. Adenosine is responsible for slowing down nerve activity in our brains, giving us the cue to calm down and take a nap. Also, adenosine is responsible for regulating neurotransmitters in the brain, such as dopamine. As you can see, adenosine is also quite similar to caffeine in structure, which is why caffeine binds so easily to the adenosine protein receptors. Once connected, caffeine increases the activity of neurotransmitters like dopamine, ultimately leading to heightened brain activity. Then the 3 metabolites perform their own specific functions. Theobromine increases oxygen and nutrient flow to the brain. Paraxanthin enhances your body's athletic performance by increasing the rate of fat breakdown to fuel muscle activity. Theophylline increases your heart rate and reinforces your ability to concentrate. And although these effects come together to produce a state of wakefulness, too much caffeine can turn sour pretty quick. At higher doses, caffeine is known to cause jitters, anxiety, and just general all-around discomfort. For this reason, scientists have found that 400 milligrams is the safest average dose of caffeine for adults. To put that into perspective, that would be around 3 8-ounce cups of coffee, 5 8-ounce Red Bulls, or a whopping 8 cups of black tea. And on a side note, scientists have also found that caffeine becomes toxic around 10 grams, which works out to be about 75 cups of coffee or 180 cups of black tea. However, the lethal limit does vary widely from person to person. Hey, thanks for watching, folks.
So it is possible, definitely, to overdose on caffeine. You do have to take a lot of it, but it is possible. Please be careful.
With its stimulating effects, it's easy to understand why coffee is the second most traded commodity on Earth after oil. For many, it keeps us awake and moving through our busy days. But how does it work? What exactly does coffee do to your brain? Whenever you're awake, a chemical called adenosine slowly accumulates in your brain, and this adenosine binds to receptors which slow down brain activity. Ultimately, the more adenosine there is, the more tired your brain feels, which makes sense as the longer you're awake, the more fatigued you become. Conversely, while you sleep, the concentration of adenosine declines, gradually promoting wakefulness. But it turns out that the caffeine in your coffee is incredibly similar to adenosine in structure. The caffeine works its way through your bloodstream and into your brain, where it starts to compete and binds with adenosine receptors. But because it's not adenosine, the sleepiness effect isn't felt. Adenosine can no longer bind, meaning its calming properties are diminished, which is great for you when you're feeling tired. However, with long-term use of caffeine, your brain responds by creating more adenosine receptors, which means more caffeine is required to elicit the same response. It also means that when you try to quit drinking coffee or miss your daily intake, you might experience some withdrawal symptoms and feel more tired than you would have before you ever drank coffee. But the caffeine doesn't stop there. It also stimulates the production of adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone. This increases your heart rate, gets your blood pumping, and even opens up your airways. Furthermore, it affects dopamine levels by preventing its reabsorption in the brain, which makes you feel happy. In fact, this is the exact same thing that cocaine does, just to a lesser degree. It's a drug after all. This dopamine stimulation is also the aspect of coffee that makes it moderately addictive. So, can you drink too much coffee? It turns out there is a lethal dose of caffeine, which is somewhere around 150 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of your body. This means if you weigh 70 kilograms, you would require 14,000 milligrams of caffeine to overdose. Put into perspective, an average cup of coffee contains roughly 150 milligrams of caffeine, meaning if you're 70 kilograms, approximately 70 cups of coffee would kill you. However, you'd have to drink those cups all at once, making it effectively impossible to overdose on caffeine from coffee, since you wouldn't be able to physically fit that much in your stomach. You would also start experiencing mania and hallucinations before getting to this point. Caffeine also has a half-life of around 6 hours, so if you drank a standard coffee with around 150 milligrams of caffeine, after about 6 hours there'll only be 75 milligrams left in your system and you'll be feeling half of the effect. And 6 hours after that, you'll have 37.5 milligrams, leaving more room for adenosine to jump back into action, which is why you may reach for another cup throughout the day to maintain that glorious, alert, and energetic feeling. So drink up and enjoy the buzz while it lasts.
So, nicotine is a natural stimulant that's mainly found in tobacco. Nicotine is very addictive, and that's why the whole cigarette market is, still booming. Withdrawal from nicotine is very common and prevents many people from actually successfully quitting. And, we're not necessarily going to talk about the uprising of Vape Nation, but people are championing the use of vape cigarettes as healthy alternatives, although the science looking at vaping is not really conducive to it being healthy. So this is the leading cause of preventable deaths worldwide. And widespread damage to the body does occur, particularly through smoking, and that's something that's not necessarily news to many people. But secondhand smoke can be dangerous as well, where it can reduce life expectancy, particularly in use, 10 to 15 years. Now, behavioral self-management techniques can be used to decrease individuals' dependence and use of nicotine, particularly cigarettes, such as scheduling gradual reduction rather than going cold turkey and once. Use of e-cigarettes may be used for a short amount of time to ultimately enable the person to quit. Now moving into downers, so narcotics. So these are derived from opium poppies, morphine, codeine, heroin, which is further refined morphine. These produce powerful feelings of euphoria, reductions in anxiety, and pain relief, which is often why they are abused. Methadone is a drug that's often used to treat narcotics addicts. They're freely given as part of a harm reduction strategy, which gets rid of negative consequences of addiction without requiring drug abstinence. Now, downers, particularly narcotics, decrease our heart rate. And if you mix these types of narcotics with alcohol, and alcohol is a depressant, then you can be in serious trouble by the fact of interactions between these different drugs on the brain and causing a damaging effect.
Before we can explore your brain on opiates, we need to understand a few things. An opiate is a chemical derived from opium and is the key ingredient in heroin. Those narcotics in your medicine cabinet, codeine, oxycodone, hydrocodone, they're opiate-like, but they are man-made and more commonly referred to as opioids. So how do these chemicals affect the brain? One big way is by exerting powerful pain relief to the rest of the body. Chemicals flood the system and latch onto millions of opiate receptors peppered throughout the body. Think of opiates and their receptors like puzzle pieces. When they bind together, pain signals are dulled, or they go away altogether. If the brain already has opiate receptors, doesn't that mean it can naturally provide pain relief? That's right. Feel-good chemicals like endorphins are natural opiates that dull pain and also give you a rush. The problem with man-made opiates that mimic endorphins, take too many and they can overwhelm the system, give you too much of a rush. That can lead to dependence or abuse. Addiction becomes an even bigger problem because opiates also slow down breathing and heart rate. Mix them with other things that slow down your body, and everything could grind to a halt. In fact, every 19 minutes, someone dies of an accidental prescription drug overdose. Most of the time, it involves an opiate. It's now more common than dying in a car crash. If you want to avoid that fate, don't take more than you're prescribed. Don't use other people's prescriptions. Never mix opiates with alcohol. And maybe try other ways of alleviating your pain, like over-the-counter pain relievers and good old-fashioned exercise.
Barbiturates are sedative drugs that depress brain activity. These are also in the category of downers. They're medically used to calm or to induce sleep in patients. Now, at mild doses, barbiturates are similar in their effects similar to alcohol, but at high doses, this can lead to mental confusion or hallucinations. Now, overdoses of barbiturates lead to loss of consciousness and possibly death due to the fact that activity in important brain structures such as the medulla are depressed. So, barbiturates are really abused due to the fact that they produce those similar feelings to alcohol. But again, the risks of them include not only drowsiness, but respiratory depression, and then, of course, physiological dependence. Tranquilizers help to lower anxiety and reduce tension. Examples of these downers include Valium, Xanax, and Librium. Prescribed benzodiazepine tranquilizers to alleviate nervousness and stress. So even at normal ranges, these can lead to drowsiness, confusion, and shakiness. And repeated use can definitely cause physical dependence.
I'm coming. Hey! There he is. There, my old buddy bud. What's with him? Mr. Polly dumped him on me and he couldn't get to sleep, so I gave him a glass of warm milk with a handful of my mom's Valium in it.
He still wouldn't shut up, so tag, you're it. I'm back.
Still don't know why you left.
I can't tell you.
Why not?
I promised Penny.
Promised Penny what?
I wouldn't tell you the secret.
Shh. What secret? Tell me the secret.
Mom smokes in the car. Jesus is okay with it, but we can't tell Dad.
Not that secret. The other secret.
I'm Batman.
Damn it, shut it! You said Penny told you a secret. What's the secret?
Okay, I'll tell you. But you can't tell Leonard.
I promise.
Penny lied about graduating from community college because she's afraid she's not smart enough for Leonard.
So it's nothing I did? It's her problem?
I drank milk that tasted funny.
Penny thinks I'm too smart for her. That's ridiculous.
I know. Most of your work is extremely derivative. But don't worry, that's not a secret. Everybody knows.
So definitely in mainstream media, even references to, these drugs are made, lightly. But again, with repeated use, these drugs can result in physical dependence. So one of the most famous downers, alcohol, also known as ethyl alcohol, is not a stimulant despite popular belief. It is a physiological depressant. And the reason for that is because alcohol actually acts on GABA receptors in the brain, and GABA receptors actually allow for chloride ions, which carry a -1 charge, to flow through into the cell and cause it to hyperpolarize. Now, in small amounts, this does lead to lowered inhibition, relaxation, and euphoria, but larger amounts can lead to loss of consciousness. Now, why people choose to drink can actually cause people's different reactions to alcohol. So think about it. If you're drinking alcohol to have a good time or to forget about your problems, those are going to result in different reactions. So thinking and perception tends to become very dull and short-sighted, and this is what's known as alcohol myopia, which is only when the most obvious and immediate stimuli catch a drinker's attention. So restraints on behavior are banished from the drinker's mind. Now, binge drinking is a really big issue when it comes to alcohol. So downing 5+ or 4+ for women in a very short time can be considered binge drinking. And this is an issue since the brain continues to develop into your early 20s up to about 25. So binge drinking on a normal occasion can actually affect memory capacity and the ability of your brain to work properly. Now, there are many differences between individuals in terms of how much alcohol they can consume, including if you're male or female, if you are skinny or very heavy. One of the big things is to moderate your drinking. Antabuse is a drug that will actually lead to individuals becoming violently ill if they consume alcohol while they have antabuse in their system. Now, the way that antabuse works is it prevents the alcohol byproduct, the byproduct of alcohol metabolism, from being essentially broken down. And so it's acetaldehyde dehydrogenase is an enzyme that will aid in breaking down alcohol. However, antabuse blocks that, and so it essentially leads to accumulation of toxic byproducts, which cause you to become violently ill. Now, if you have a problem with drinking, obviously get help, please. There's the Counseling and Psychological Services on campus, or AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Detox is often used by individuals, and that can help with resolving health. And so here's just a graph looking at the age and years, looking roughly at individuals who are undergoing binge use, not heavy alcohol use in blue, and then current use with percent using in past month in the y-axis.
Alcohol. One of the most commonly used and abused drugs in the world, comes in a variety of forms and does one thing quickly and well. It changes the way you feel. But to what do we owe these feelings of release and freedom? How could the ingestion of one simple substance so drastically change not only your actions, but thoughts and perception? As alcohol enters the body and makes its way to your brain, it begins to interact with your neurons or brain cells. In our previous video on marijuana, which you can click here, we explain the actions of neurons and their chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. But there are two main types of neurotransmitters that these neurons use to communicate or send electrical signals. Excitatory neurons use glutamate, while inhibitory neurons use GABA, the yin and yang, if you will. Much like the zeros and ones of a computer, these two messengers have contrasting roles. Glutamate begins a wave of excitation, while GABA not only inhibits this flow, but helps to organize and differentiate the results in your brain. And just like a computer, these signals can be combined in enormous complexity to form actions and thoughts. So how does alcohol affect these two signals? Turns out it suppresses glutamate transmission and enhances GABA transmission, so you get less excitation and more inhibition. And because glutamate sites become less effective, information flow becomes slow, and only the largest signals can make it through. This means you feel less, perceive less, notice less, and remember less. In conjunction, the increased GABA hushes the excessive background noise of activity, fine-tuning and clarifying your thoughts, but to an excessive degree. This is why you may have heard that alcohol is a depressant. But inhibition of your neurons is not the same as social inhibition. Instead, it simply cleans up and removes extraneous activity by removing less significant excitation. Without normal GABA transmission, the excessive excitatory action would resemble an epileptic seizure. There would be no clarity of thought. While drunk, your GABA channels are wide opened. Combined with the lack of glutamate, you begin to think very little, but with great clarity. It's what causes the momentous attitude of a drunk, often repeating the same idea or proclamation over and over. Thinking clearly about almost nothing. Got it.
Now, the last drugs that we're going to talk about are hallucinogens, particularly LSD and marijuana. So hallucinogens, although a general stimulant, have the main effect of altering our sensory impressions or sensory sensations. So LSD, which is lysergic acid diethylamide, or commonly referred to as acid, can produce hallucinations and psychotic-like disturbances in thinking and our perception. So two common hallucinogens and other common hallucinogens compared to LSD are mescaline or peyote and psilocybin, which are magic mushrooms. And PCP, which is known as angel dust, which is phencyclidine, is an anesthetic that can also have hallucinogenic effects.
Psychedelic or magic mushrooms have been ingested by humans for over 9,000 years. Even today, this naturally grown fungus is commonly used as a recreational drug, causing hallucinations. But how exactly does it work? The main psychoactive ingredient in shrooms is called psilocybin. When ingested, the body breaks it down into the active drug psilocin, which makes its way to the brain. And here it begins to prevent the reuptake of the neurotransmitter serotonin, increasing its activity. On top of this, psilocin actually has a similar chemical structure to serotonin, meaning it can also bind to and stimulate receptors in the brain. This amplified stimulation causes you to perceive and experience things without any real stimulus, also known as hallucination. These can be of a varying nature, from visual to auditory sensations or mystical and insightful feelings. And while the experience can be quite enjoyable, some users have reported very unpleasant episodes. These feelings generally last between 3 to 8 hours, but could feel much longer as the drug alters your sense of time. Scientists have also suggested that the brain may temporarily rearrange itself by inhibiting normal brain activity and immediately creating new biologically stable brain connections. This ultimately makes it harder to determine reality from fantasy and amplifies your intensity of thought, which makes planning ahead and self-conscious thinking almost impossible. We also see activation in the hippocampus and anterior cingulate cortex, which are associated with dreaming. Finally, specific emotional regions of the brain are chemically activated, which can lead to a sense of expanding consciousness. And because the drug temporarily alters the paths in your brain, thinking outside the box becomes extremely natural. In a famous US study, 36 college-educated participants were given psilocybin and observed in a laboratory. 1/3 of the participants reported the experience as the single most spiritually significant moment in their lives, with 2/3 putting it in their top 5. 2 months after taking the drug, 79% of the participants reported increased well-being and satisfaction. Friends and family were also interviewed and agreed with these claims. But it's not all so positive. 22% of the clinically tested individuals experienced fear and paranoia at certain points during their trip, and because of the state of their brains, these typically manifested as terrifying and uncontrollable hallucinations. Though much is still unknown about shrooms, they're not considered clinically addictive and cause little toxicity to other organ systems. In fact, a UK study found that they caused the least amount of damage, both to the individual and to others, when compared to other recreational drugs. Ultimately, scientists believe that the laws need to change around clinical testing of the drug so advanced research can be executed to fully understand both the positive and negative effects that this magic fungus has on our brain. And if you haven't seen our video on this...
And so the last drug that we'll talk about is marijuana, also known as pot, grass, reefer, Mary Jane, etc. So marijuana is derived from the hemp plant, with the main ingredient being tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Now, these can also activate neurons with endocannabinoid receptors, or CB1 and CB2 receptors in the brain. Now, at low doses, marijuana can provide a sense of euphoria, relaxation, altered time sense, perceptual distortion, and at high doses can lead to paranoia, hallucinations, and even delusions. Now, many of you have heard about individuals who smoke marijuana that may get the munchies. Well, there is research showing that marijuana does influence pro-obeomelanocortin neurons, whose activity normally signals satiety or you're feeling full. But under THC, which is the main ingredient in marijuana, it actually becomes a drive for hunger, causing you to feel incredibly hungry. So there's actually a physiological mechanism for why this occurs. Now, around a day after smoking, you can still see impairments in attention, coordination, and short-term memory. Now, marijuana does produce more psychological dependence rather than physical dependence, meaning that individuals will want to go and obtain that same psychological response that they had under marijuana, but they're not necessarily doing it to get rid of withdrawal symptoms. So risks of smoking marijuana may increase the risk of a variety of cancers. THC can affect developing fetuses if a woman who is pregnant is smoking marijuana. THC can unnecessarily suppress the body's immune system. And one of the things that most people know is that THC can impair memory functions.
Psychedelic.
Not brain on shrooms. But we'll look at this one.
As marijuana becomes legalized throughout North America, many are trying edibles for the first time as a healthier option. But with edible marijuana providing such a different experience than smoking, how does it work, and is eating pot actually better for you? When you heat cannabis, you effectively change the chemical makeup of compounds within it called cannabinoids. Smoking heats it to around 800 degrees Celsius and converts THCA to delta-9 THC, which binds to receptors in your brain, making them continually fire and causing your imagination, thoughts, and perceptions to magnify. This is why every thought can feel like a significant one. And because it travels straight from your lungs into the bloodstream and to your brain, the drug works within minutes and lasts about 2 to 3 hours. But when making edibles, the weed is heated to around 150 degrees Celsius, burning less of the actual plant and minimizing carcinogens. THC is lipophilic, not water-soluble, so the activated THC must be dissolved into something fatty like oil or butter. And once this substance is consumed, the onset of the high is delayed as the drug is absorbed more slowly through your gut. But this high typically lasts 4 to 8 hours, and most report feeling more high than compared to smoking marijuana. This is because when you eat edible weed, the THC is first metabolized by the liver before entering the bloodstream, and here delta-9 THC also becomes 11-OH-THC, which passes the brain barrier more rapidly and is a more potent chemical. So using the same amount of marijuana, you actually get more high with edibles because it ends up creating both delta-9 THC and 11-OH-THC, which is a stronger compound. And because there are more psychotropic types of cannabinoids acting on your neurons, you'll be high for longer. Of course, you also get to skip out on the toxic chemicals that smoking provides, like carbon monoxide, bronchial irritants, and tumor initiators. Smoking anything means you're inhaling cancer-causing molecules, so if you can get high without smoking, it will be healthier for your lungs and body. The downside? It's much harder to control the high you'll get, Because it can take up to 1 to 2 hours to feel the full effects, and the dosage can vary significantly, modulating the effects, or titrating as it's called, is much more difficult, and as a result you can end up a lot higher than you intended to. But unlike those who consume too much alcohol, opioids, or other drugs, you won't be suffering any serious long-term harm, toxicity, or lethal overdose if you do consume more than you intended. If you've ever wondered why marijuana gives you the munchies,
And this is just a brief summary of the psychoactive drugs that we talked about. By no means do you need to memorize this chart, but this is just a good short reference looking at tolerance, risk of physical dependence, risk of psychological dependence, and fatal overdose potential. So that's pretty much it for our discussion on consciousness for sleep and drugs. And this is the last chapter in the first test material. So your first test will cover chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, and chapter 5. So all of this stuff that we've gone up to so far. And the exam will be online this upcoming week on Friday the 30th, and you'll have until July 2nd to complete the exam. So please make sure that you go online and get the exam done. Please remember, it is open book, open note, but not open friend. And there are a mixture of multiple choice, true, false, short answer, fill in the blank, etc. So please make sure that you look at that and get that to me. And I hope that you guys have a good rest of your week and a good week next week.